Okay, so welcome to the panel. Nice to meet you all. Nice hat, thank you. So, how to develop an effective raiding mindset. Yes, I did put together a PowerPoint. It's a pretty broad topic, but I thought that might make it more approachable for the widest range of audience, rather than going into specifics. We can go into specifics along the way. One moment, need some water. But first of all, actually, hang on, let me just clear my throat. I haven't been talking, so that obviously built up over time. So who am I? Hello, I'm Zeph. I've been raiding since A Realm Reborn, which is going on 8 years now. I was sort of pugging most of the way, and then in Stormblood Sigmascape tier, I did my first hardcore prog, and I pretty much got hooked on that since then. So I went on to found Team Oversleepers and raided with those guys for 2.5 years. You might have seen us raiding, might have seen some of my teammates, pretty well known around these parts. And I've pugged a lot over this time period. Definitely thousands of clears in Savage and Ultimate combined, possibly getting close to 10,000, not really sure. So, what's this panel about? First of all, how to stay sane while raiding. Keeping positive in a rough party. How to keep improving to achieve your potential as a raider. And you can submit questions to be answered at the end of the panel, and I'll share the link in chat periodically, which is right here. Alright, so I'll start with the basics, because some of you may not have raided before. So how do you start raiding? And I always tell people, best place to start is normal modes and alliance raids, because these are the most forgiving raids that you can go into. Normal modes especially are basically an easy version of Savage, and they'll give you exposure to the mechanics that you expect to see in Savage, but not everything, obviously, but you can sort of understand how they start to work. Alliance raids are also very forgiving. You can die plenty of times, and it will be inconsequential, so it's a really good place to practice. Practice doing your rotation, and try and get mechanics at the same time. And you don't have to feel like you're holding back anyone if you make mistakes, because even if a bunch of people die, the raid usually still clears anyway. So step 2, once you're comfortable with this, move up into extremes. These are also relatively forgiving and recoverable, but they do have enrages. So you're required to do a bit more damage, you need to know your rotation a little bit better, and the mechanics are a little more complex than the normals and alliance raids. They do, however, introduce you to a type of party coordination that will be required of you in Savage, so this is the best place to get your feet wet before moving up. Hello Chucky, welcome on in. And then once you feel comfortable in extremes, you can beat them with no or few mistakes, I'd say you're ready for Savage. Which is, there, let me just do the next. Yep. So, when going into Savage for the first time, it's a good idea to watch or read a guide, even if you only retain the first 2 or 3 mechanics. So, you don't need to worry about retaining an entire fight's worth. When you first go in, no one's really expecting that of you, especially if you join learning parties. So, either join one or host one, and just say what the prog point is, first, second mechanic. Ideally, you know the name of the mechanic, so you put it in the PF, and people will join with that expectation, so it's a pretty stress-free environment. And on top of that, there are lots of people that just want to help, myself included, and there are plenty of other people I know. I have friends, I have streamer friends, I even know people that don't stream. In fact, before I was a streamer, I used to just join parties and host parties and just help people through content because I love raiding and that's what I want to do. So helping people was one of the ways that basically I could get my fix. Hopeless addict over here. But I mean, that means there are people like me. So just need to find the right party. You can get your first experience in Savage and sort of build up from there. Alright, so first thing going into just general raiding, might sound a little cheesy, but it's respect in all caps. Respect for your teammates. Because raiding is a team game, and if you don't have a party, then you don't get to raid. Let me just get down in my notes. So, sometimes people are just having an off day, but it doesn't mean they're a bad player. Everyone starts somewhere. Today's beginner might be an amazing player down the line. If you're rude to them when they're learning and burn bridges with them, you lose the opportunity to play with them later. And it goes both ways. So obviously, this is sort of talking from your perspective, how you treat your teammates, but it goes both ways. The more respect everyone gives, the more we receive. So ideally, you want to be the change you want to see in the world. Give respect, you get it back. So this is another big one, which I think is apparent more on European servers, which is text is terrible at conveying tone, and bluntness does not equal anger necessarily. Just because someone was blunt, don't assume they're malicious. So this can be a language barrier thing. Sometimes people don't know how to be more nuanced with the way they're saying things, and some people just straight up speak their mind. In my experience, people are rarely genuinely angry, so I try to apply a blanket rule of assuming that everyone means well. But we can also try to mitigate this misunderstanding of tone via text by framing things as a suggestion on what to do, rather than what they did wrong. So try not to say to someone that made a mistake, try not to say, you did this wrong, but instead say something like, the spot next to me is always open. You can stand there and you won't hit anyone, just as an example. It's, yeah, I mean, it kind of is how to be a better human, but like I said, raiding's a team game, so... Oh, Boyus, the cat is on my keyboard. 1 second. Yeah, so it's important to... Oh, Boyus, please. It is important to treat other people well in raiding. If you upset someone with the way you speak to them, you'll only cause them to play worse. And that's just shooting yourself in the foot because you're stuck in the raid there with them. So, you know, build up the players around you. And try and... Because you want the clear, right? So try and help other people in your party to play better. And you'll probably get what you're after, the clear. Or you increase your chances at least. Oh, by the way, feel free to ask me questions in chat along the way, and or submit them via the link there. I'll get to them. I'll try and get through all of them at the end of the stream. But yeah, I feel like this is the sort of topic where it's good to have a conversation about it, because some of you guys might bring up questions or concerns along the way, and I can sort of just talk about it and answer that, because it might be something that I hadn't really thought to address. So go ahead. Alright, so next, you don't know what you don't know. What does this mean? Mechanics can have extra details we're completely unaware of. So, for example, with my group, so this is potentially a raid spoiler, I'll use very general terms, but the last fight in the current raid tier, the strategy my team came up with for a particular mechanic where it would tether every player with an orb, and then you had to run into an orb tethered to another player of the opposite role. We came up with a strategy that had tanks healers in a line and DPS in a line, and we would basically pair up and run and soak the orbs together. The way we were doing it just happened to resolve things in the correct way, and we didn't even realize there was an entire extra component of the mechanic that was supposed to be solved that we were doing accidentally. So I went into pugging, and I'm looking at the pug strats, and they're doing things a certain way, and I just couldn't understand where this was coming from. Like, why do you have people standing on a certain side? Why are people swapping positions? Because there was an extra bit of information that I just didn't know about. So it's important to always be open-minded and be ready to take in new things. So the next point, the first way you learn to do something isn't necessarily the best. So, as defined by the decisionlab.com, it's also on Wikipedia if you look up anchoring bias, but Wikipedia was a little bit more obtuse in their wording. Basically, anchoring bias is a cognitive bias that causes us to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we are given about a topic. So, what this means is you're likely to think that the first strategy you learn, in the context of Final Fantasy, the first strategy you learn is the best way to do something. Almost always, the first strategies to be developed are the worst. Just because, going back to the previous point, people haven't figured out all the extra information about a mechanic yet. E8S Ilya is a good one. Ilya strat for E8S was a prog strat, and it worked, but it wasn't the most efficient way to do things, and it was very error prone. So again, it's really important to be able to adapt to new strats as they come, which is sort of going to be the next point. Well, that's actually one thing I did want to say. So always be ready to learn new strats, and I think if you're raiding week 1 or week 2 and you get a clear, if you can learn the fight from scratch in 1 to 2 weeks, you can probably learn a new strat for a mechanic in just a lockout. So if you're around for Eden's versus Tyr, you'll be very familiar with the general stubbornness to move on from particular strats, and even Eden's Promise as well, with Brambles, as is being mentioned. P3S is another one, but that does bring me to my next point, which is learning the mechanic and not just the strategy allows you to adapt to any way of doing things. So technically, any strat works, and you'll be a better player for it if you learn how the mechanic works and not just the strategy. Because that means you can go into any party and generally have an idea about how it's supposed to work. And you might take 1 or 2 tries, but understanding how the mechanic works and not just following a strategy step by step will let you be more adaptable and more successful overall. So responding, what worries you about learning new strats is you have something down pat with an older strat, and then when people want you to adjust to a new strat, they aren't always patient about a learning curve in PF. And yeah, that's true. Which is, I mean, that is a thing that exists. It's the unfortunate reality, and I think we do need to, in general, open the space a little bit more for adjusting to new strats. And some people, the typical thing that happens is you go into a party and someone will say, can we try this strat, it's better. Or like, a new strat came out, it seems better, can we try it? And people will say, just do what we know for the weekly, and then do the other strats in reclears the rest of the week. But what the reality of what happens is you do the old strat for the weekly, and then you go into reclears in the rest of the week, like maybe you're just raiding for fun, and people still just want to do the old strat. So yeah, it would be good if we could all collectively learn to move on from week 1 or week 2 strats. What about people being ableistic? Do you mean basically saying it's easy because I can do it? Yeah, so that's a general... That's an attitude problem, unfortunately, and I do actually have some points on that later. Let's see, let's move on. Alright, so we'll get to that later, but let's start with this. So, it's always winnable. The pull is always winnable. Capital W. A pull gone wrong is not a disaster, it's an opportunity to practice recovery. And recovery is a learned skill that does require practice. And too many people, when a pull goes wrong, they're very fast to, especially healers, are very fast to run straight to the wall. And if you do that every single time, you'll never learn the limits of what you're capable of. Sort of the, you know, the limits of your job, what can and can't be done in a certain situation. Also learning who do you need to raise first? Like, do you need to get the tank up? Do you need, like caster, getting the caster up so they can raise someone is usually the priority, unless, for example, there's a double tank buster coming up and you need both tanks alive. So yeah, it's something that needs to be practiced. So get into the habit of every single time something goes wrong, don't give up, start testing things. So what you can also do is test the limits of a mechanic. So for example, if you're a melee and the boss does what's known as what we call a chariot mechanic, it does an AoE around itself, you might not know whether you can safely max melee, and because you're progging, you've just played it safe and you've backed off every single time, and you lose a GCD. But when something's going wrong, you have the opportunity to test the distance. So you can go max melee, you can see if you survive, and if you die, it's no harm, no foul, because the pool was kind of falling apart anyway, right? So it's the best opportunity to test that. Obviously, it's better to not do that during a good pull. You'll see that pretty commonly. Melee greed, which is, it's the wrong way to try and optimize your rotation. You should always play on the side of safety first. So if you're unsure about distances or timing, always just back off early, and then pull by pull, you can sort of peel it back. So maybe you leave for 2 GCDs, which is very safe, and then you leave 1 GCD early on the next one, and then maybe you want to just, there's a wipe happening, so you just want to test if you can stay there the entire time, or you just want to test how late you can leave. And so that's sort of your testing ground without griefing the party on a good pull. Like, you don't want to be the first person to die. That's pretty much the big point here. It's, if it's already falling apart, that's okay. But if the pull is going smoothly, play safe, just get through the mechanics. Really important in prog. And really important in reclears as well, because complacency is one of the biggest wipe mechanics, basically. People are too comfortable, and they're just sort of greeting left and right, and they're complacent about what they're doing, and if everyone in the party does that, the chance of something going wrong is really high. Best way to find a static, I can direct you to the Q&A. That's a question best left for the end, I think. I'll get to that at the end. Okay, so next point. Rather than laying blame on someone, think about what you could have done to fix the situation. So, a wipe's just happened, and yes, someone will have been at fault, like the domino that first fell, that sort of led to the consequences, the things that went wrong. And oftentimes it's easy to wipe and just go, well, that wasn't my fault, so that's not my problem. Which is it's not a bad attitude. Like, I'm not going to say you're doing the wrong thing, but it's not the best attitude. What you should be doing is thinking, what could I have done to improve the situation? Because maybe someone made a mistake and it caused chaos, but maybe it was also recoverable if everyone did everything in their power to try and recover. So obviously healers are going to be trying to raise, hopefully. But as a tank, you might be sitting on cooldowns, you might be sitting on an invuln. This is actually, if you happen to have an invuln, it's a really good time to use it, because it means that the healers don't have to worry about you while they're getting other people up. So invulns being 10 seconds long, healers can hardcast, like they might be out of swift casts, so they can hardcast raise extra people while you're being self-sufficient, and then obviously self-healing. And basically, if you had a plan for, like you had a mitigation plan, that goes out the window the moment recovery happens, because you need to throw whatever you have at the situation to try and recover it, because it's better making it through that situation and not having what you need later than just straight up dying in the moment. Because it could be that, you know, maybe you have a scholar and they manage to crit an adlo on you as a tank, then you can do without the cooldowns. So because you used them earlier, it's not going to necessarily be an issue. It can be worked around, but it's better off getting to that point, getting past the mechanic and seeing what's next without what you normally would have. But also, so this isn't just about tanks. I'm a tank player, so that's sort of my perspective, but also melees. Did you ask yourself, in a recovery situation, another thing is people might just start dropping one by one. So a bunch of people might have died. A raid wide is coming up. The healers are trying to get up. Let's say 3 people died, and you're up as a melee. So the other 3 DPS are dead. You're up as a melee, and all 8 people are required for an upcoming mechanic. But there's a raid wide, and you're sitting on 50% HP. A melee can use Bloodbath and Second Wind, and you know there's other job specific utility, but pretty much my personal immediate reaction to someone dying or like something going wrong is I just hit both those buttons and I make sure I top my HP as much as possible, because that raid wide, if it kills you, that might turn a recoverable situation into an unrecoverable one. But if you manage to survive, that could be the difference maker. And also Feint, yes. Ideally you're using Feint sort of constantly. In fact, that's sort of a general tip, which is you're better off using your mitigation rather than saving it for a rainy day, because that can stop a bad situation from happening in the first place. And even I make this mistake sometimes, which is I'm not sure when my co-tank, as a tank, I'm not sure when they're using Reprisal, and so I hold mine, and then I kind of just miss using it. So I think in the moment I should use Reprisal here, but it's like, oh, I think they're going to use it here. And so I hold it, and then I just forget on the next thing. And then the next thing, their Reprisal's back up, and I'm like, well, I've just missed an entire use. So it's better to use it than not. And just take note, if you happen to double up, just make a mental note and go, okay, on the next one, I'll hold it and use it on the thing after that. And so that goes for casters with Addle, it goes for tanks with Reprisal, and melees with Feint. And yeah, you'd rather your tanks overwrite Reprisal every time than never Reprisal the entire raid. And yeah, just generally, if you're starting out, try and just treat, because people are very good at using their offensive OG cities, their offensive cooldowns on cooldown. Not so good. It's not so common for people to be good using their defensive cooldowns on cooldown. And while there is a bit of nuance to it, when you're first starting out, I would say just use it. If you see something it can be used on, just use it. It may not be the most efficient or optimal place to put it, but it's a good starting place. So you just use it there, and then adjust. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because I think this is in my later slides. Actually, no, it's literally on this slide right here. It's focus on one thing to improve each pull. So, speaking of mitigation, you might just think to yourself, I'm using it on cooldown, but the second use didn't really do anything. So on this next pull, I'm going to hold that one specifically and try and move it to the next best place and just work from there. Or maybe it could be a rotation thing. Maybe you're just working on your rotation and you're sort of unfamiliar with, like, you might be a beginner raider. So this could go back to normal raiding where you're just starting out. So just take it one step at a time. So, and also, big point, mechanics first. So I always say there's no shame in dropping your rotation if you have to deal with mechanics. And when I'm progging, when I'm hardcore progging, and I'm doing a mechanic I've only seen once or twice, I will just stop pressing buttons and just focus on the mechanic. And there's no shame in that. You don't need to do damage during prog. Damage only matters once you're on Enrage. And oh boy, he just went ahead at my points. He's stepping on the keyboard. 1 second. Yeah, so a lot of people prioritize doing damage too early. And it sort of goes back to the point above, right? Testing the limits of mechanic. You only really want to be doing that on a wiping pull. If you can't guarantee that what you're going to do is 100% safe, or you're unsure, then just don't do it. On a clean pull, don't do it. Even if you've managed to greed before, if it's kind of sketchy, just back off 1G City earlier and don't go for it. Because you may find you get to Enrage and you just beat the fight, and it turns out that 1G City, you didn't even need it. But so if you wipe along the way, you stop people having the opportunity to practice the next mechanics. And also yourself. The more exposure you get to mechanics, it will be easier to figure out your rotation around that. Even if you're not pressing the buttons along the way the first couple of times, just seeing it and learning the movement and the timing, that starts to get internalized the more you do it. And then all of a sudden, doing your rotation alongside it is a little bit more natural, a little bit less distracting. And so that's sort of what you do when you're first starting out. It could be normal raids or alliance raids when you're an absolute beginner, or it could be in Savage, where the first thing you want to focus on is getting the mechanics down, and then step by step try and work in your rotation. And you might only be doing your rotation in empty space between mechanics, and then a hard mechanic starts and it has particular movement timing. It's okay to just stop pressing buttons if you need to. And I myself do that. Because the number one priority for any party is getting to Enrage. And that's why you also want to practice recovery, because even if the DPS check is an absolute disaster, everyone's hit the floor at least once, as long as you recover, you can see all the way through. And usually, in my experience, the moment you see Enrage, it's like a magic moment where all the other mechanics before it start to fall in line. So it's this weird thing where you're sort of uncomfortable with the mechanics you see in Rage, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we've done all this before. And it's suddenly easier to do. But obviously, there can be a big pitfall there, which is people see Enrage and they start pushing their damage too hard. So they think, oh, we're on Enrage, time to do damage. And I say, no, just relax a little bit, because again, you may not need those few extra D-cities that you are greeting. If the 4 melees, so let's just say your party has 2 melees, 2 tanks, if all 4 of them miss 1 G-city, that may not make the difference anyway, but you're taking a risk by pushing things a little bit too hard, and then what usually happens is a group will just get stuck on one particular mechanic because everyone's pushing a little bit too hard. So you want to iterate on your play bit by bit. The whole party wants to, but if we're talking as an individual, you want to iterate bit by bit. So just... And usually, there are more things that can be improved than that 1 G-city. Unless you're perfect everywhere else in the fight, I wouldn't worry about that 1 G-city. So always put your focus on the easier things to do first, the safer things to do first, and then see how you go for Enrage. And I would be very surprised if you did all of that and you still didn't clear. Right, next slide. It's okay to make mistakes. And this is a really big one. In every team that I've been in, every static, I always tell them mistakes are okay. Don't feel bad about mistakes. Because, well, first of all, everyone makes mistakes and everyone has bad days. And sometimes that's just out of your control. Sometimes you're just mentally distracted and you just slip up. And you shouldn't feel bad about that, because it's your attitude towards other people. If you get upset at other people for making mistakes, you're just going to cause them to basically tilt them. They're going to start worrying about their mistakes. Let me see if I had... No, I didn't have an extra slide pointing that out. So, as the person that made the mistake, dwelling on past mistakes is a distraction that can lead to more mistakes. So, if you slipped up on a particular mechanic, what I say to do is think about how you could have improved that. Think about what you could have done in that moment to stop that from happening, and then put it behind you and just focus on the next pull. Because in my experience, and I think it applies to pretty much everyone, if during the pull you're thinking too much, I don't want to make that mistake, I'm going to try and avoid making that mistake, you're going to distract yourself earlier in the fight, and you're just going to make a mistake on something else. And then that kind of just spirals into tilting. Because it's like, oh, well, now I'm just making mistake after mistake, and then you start feeling the pressure. But it goes both ways. So it's really important to treat your teammates to basically, it's okay for them to make mistakes and to be understanding of people making mistakes. Because while yes, it can get frustrating, and obviously they've wiped, so they've held the team back. You're only going to make things worse by making them feel bad. Because as it says, the party plays best when everyone feels relaxed. So I've been there before. Even if you want to get upset at someone for making repeat mistakes, you're only shooting yourself in the foot if you follow through with that. Because going back to an earlier point I made, you're in there with them. And if they're not playing well, and if you're causing them to play badly, then you're the one that's wiping with them. You're only wasting your own time. Yeah, Rinse, so that, if I go back, that goes back to this point. I don't know how much I talked about this, but give constructive criticism rather than pointing out mistakes. So Rin does have a point. You don't want to create an environment where people don't care that they made a mistake, because then yes, they might be complacent and people might get lazy. But it's important to create an environment where it's okay to make a mistake. That's sort of what I mean. Like, don't feel bad about it, and don't make people feel bad about it, because you want it to be okay for them to make a mistake. You want it to be okay for you to make a mistake, so you feel less pressure. And then giving constructive criticism. So just rather than saying, I'm repeating myself now, but rather than saying you need to stop doing that, just try and work with them, try and build them up, tell them what to do in as polite a way as possible, because people don't respond very well to harsh words or negativity. In fact, that'll be the first way. If you're speaking harshly towards someone, that's the first way to get them to ignore you and or blacklist you. And again, especially if someone is just starting out raiding and they're brand new, today's beginner might be a world first raider in a year or six months. Who knows? Like, they might be insane. And if you get blacklisted by them, you deprive yourself the opportunity of raiding with them in the future. Because maybe they could be a potential future teammate, or maybe they're in PF and you want to get a weekly clear and they're hosting and you don't get to join their party. And their parties might be really good and consistent. How do I encourage an accountable environment? You always feel really guilty coming forward with mistakes, and it makes you want to keep it to yourself, even though it ultimately hurts the party. That's an interesting one, because I was in a team once. The way I handle my own mistakes is actually internally. So a lot of people want to make it known that they acknowledge their mistake, but for me, I solve it in my own head. So I won't say anything, basically. And that's actually something I've had to work on, because my team thought that I didn't care that I'd made a mistake, when in actuality I was solving it myself, but they just didn't know that. So yeah, it is important to acknowledge that you made a mistake and that you also understand what you did. And if we're talking a static, if you're in a static, it's a little different in pugs. But in a static, I think it's the best environment where you don't need to harp on people's mistakes if it's as simple as, I'm sorry, I messed up, but I know what I did. We can go again. And ideally, for the rest of the team, that's enough. But it's also important if you mess up and you don't know exactly. So if I go forwards again, you don't know what you don't know. It's important to clarify, because maybe there's something that you didn't understand. And that happens a lot, actually, where people do things a certain way and they think they're doing it correctly. And actually, you get this funny... I've had this funny thing where 3 people made the same mistake, one after the other, without realizing they were making the same mistake as the other person. So I guess another tip is learn from other people's mistakes as well. Getting a little bit away from the initial question. But if someone has made a mistake, this applies for pugs and statics, pay attention. Because, again, you don't know what you don't know. They might have died to something that you are assuming you understand, but you don't. So other people's deaths are potential information for you to learn from. So sometimes the answer to can we change what we're doing to fix the wipes is no, whereupon you just do it another 2 or so times before asking the question again. Yeah, sometimes the strat is fine. The way things are doing the way people are doing things is fine, but people just need to warm up to it a little bit more. So it can just be honest mistakes. But if it keeps happening, then yes, you do want to ask the question, what's the problem? Can we fix it? Because if it's happening over and over again, there's obviously a misunderstanding somewhere. That's actually a good one. That's actually a really good question. So my favorite thing to ask in teaching parties is, does anyone not know why they died? That's a good one, because it's not calling out anyone specifically, but it's opening... It's sort of a gentle question, inviting someone to speak up. So I like that. I hadn't actually thought of that, but that's a really good one. Because it invites someone to speak up, and then you... the way it comes across is you will work with them to try and fix whatever it was. And oftentimes, a lot of people will just sit in silence. They'll die and they'll go, well, I had no idea what happened. And so some people will come out and say, I don't know what's going on. But if you ask the question, that will invite them to speak up, and then they can learn something. So it's always winnable. I would say, for me personally, it's not always about getting the clear. I think you should take pride in the small victories as well. So for example, just the other day, I was raiding. I was doing the final fight of the current Savage tier. And we didn't end up getting a clear after a number of hours. Like, I was sort of in and out of parties. But I was practicing my rotation. And so at the end of the day, I didn't allow myself to be frustrated that I didn't get a clear. I told myself, well, I actually improved the things I wanted to practice in my rotation. So while I didn't get to sort of see it to fruition, get the kill on the boss, I could say to myself, well, next time, tomorrow, next time I try, I'm going to be better than I was today. And so you can be proud of that. Or, in a recovery situation, let's say there are 4 towers that need to be taken, like in P4S, has to be taken by the tank's healers, you're a DPS, and someone's not standing in the tower. And so you, as a DPS, run in, you die to it, Yeah, you've died, but actually be proud of the fact that you saved the pool and you kept things going. Even if it wiped, you can sort of, like, that's recovery, and that's a skill, like adapting to the situation. Yeah, 1 death is way better than 8. And especially in my experience, if you're in a party that is doing multiple clears and people for whatever reason are trying extremely hard, you get these parties that just never clear. And so I was like, well, I've got nothing out of this. If everyone just plays for the clear in spite of what happened. So someone might die and someone goes, well, I'm walling it, or I died, let's go again. You end up spending however many hours just in and out of parties that aren't going anywhere because everyone is too quick to just throw in the towel. You're better off pulling through, because again, going back to the enrage point, you get to enrage, or you clear, and all of a sudden everything else falls in line. Sometimes parties just need a moment to mesh, especially if we're talking Party Finder. You just need a moment to sort of come together and get that coordination going, because various things might be going wrong. If you do everything you can to get to the end of the fight, you get the clear, and then you go in the instance again, and you get a second shot. And so you might spend half an hour getting the first clear, and then half an hour getting the second one. That's better than constantly going through parties that just need a fresh start for 2, 3 hours, 4 hours, however many hours you spend raiding. Getting the clear is always the #1 priority in my mind. Sorry, I just need more water. Okay. Yeah, my voice just went a little bit then. Yeah, I'm actually give me a moment because I'm out of water now, so I'll quickly go refill. Alrighty. That is better. Yeah, it's true. I've been talking a lot the past few days. Where was I though? Perhaps checking chat will sort of get me back. Okay, so I'll respond to Phantom Leo. Even if it's not recoverable, it's good to just see how far you can push it. Knowledge is power, you know, so it's good to know how much in a mechanic you can get away with. And I did touch on that before, but that brings me to another big tip I can give, which is in recovery situations, smash that LB button. If you're a tank or a healer, okay, this applies to tanks healers. DPS don't do that. But there are so many times where there's an LB1 or an LB2 and people are basically going to die. Like there's a raid wide coming up, people are going to die. And people have such an aversion to using LB1 or LB2 when it can actually be the difference maker. People usually just hold it for LB3, but you might just need LB2 or LB1 in that moment. Especially as a healer. It's really big for healers. Because LB2, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it might be 60% HP. And sometimes as a healer, you're in a recovery situation, you've just run dry on MP. You cannot heal at all. And you just need something. Like maybe you just need to top up the tank and you have literally nothing left. LB is worth it for that. It gives you the HP and it buys you that time to continue. And yeah, that's also true. Sometimes an LB1 early is free and you get the LB3 later. But it also goes back to what I said earlier, which is it's better to spend what you have now and not have it later than to never see later. And so, yeah, the LB is just adding on to what I said before about spending everything you have in a recovery situation. That does, I believe, take me to the Q&A section. I mean, it's kind of been Q&As, we've gone, but let me just share the link again. If you want any questions you'd like me to answer directly, I'll try and get through as many as possible. And, of course, you can find me at my stream, which is there, twitch.tv/Zheph Zaeora, where you'll basically find me rambling about all of this non-stop, day in, day out. And you can ask me any questions. I'm always happy to answer any questions on my stream as well. Tank LB1 is 20 to 40%. Yeah. And in fact, I used it just the other day, which kept people alive on about 5% HP. It was just an LB1, like it doesn't seem like much, but it was worth it. Yeah, okay, so it's... Rin brings up the point, it's barely noticeable clipping on your GCD, but also, would you rather everyone die and you roll your GCD, or everyone lives and you clip a little bit? Like, the choice is obvious. I didn't really want to get into the optimization side of things, because obviously it's a little bit of a grey area, but if we speak in general terms, let's just say you're trying to do as much damage as possible, right? Crit in this game is a thing, definitely. And if you have a really high crit rate on all your big abilities, but you have to compromise your rotation a little bit in order to recover the run, you're probably still going to be better off than an average run where everything you did went perfectly. Crit rate is more significant to your damage than doing everything perfectly. So if it means getting the clear, it's worth it every single time. Always try and get the clear. Alright, so, the questions, there are actually quite a few here, so I still have half an hour in this time slot, so we might be able to get through a decent amount. So, first question, what is the best way to fight Party Finder anxiety? That is a very common question, and I think a lot of people feel that. First thing you could do is potentially go in with a friend, if you can. And actually one of the further questions is, how do I socialize with people to raid? And so maybe those two sort of go hand in hand. Having people you can raid with really makes the entire experience more comfortable. So to answer the question, how do I socialize with people to raid? I may be biased as a Twitch streamer, but hanging out in Twitch streams that are raid oriented is a really good place to find like-minded people that you might get to play with. Especially the streamer themselves, but not necessarily the streamer. So obviously people like me and Rin and Lamatod and Gerald, just to name a few, we run parties all the time. Those are really good places to hop in and get a first experience in a more comfortable and sort of respectful environment. Like you're not expecting, you don't expect to come up against any nasty people in those parties. We make sure of that. Because we want people to have a positive raiding experience. And then through that, and through Twitch, you can also find people on your data center that you might be able to join up with, or you might make a friend through one of those parties. And like Rin said, we want more raiders. So the reason we do this, it goes right back. Let me go back to my slide. Raiding is a team game, and as I said, if you don't have people to play with, you don't get to raid. And so it's actually in our best interest to get more people into raiding, because we love raiding, and there are a lot of people that love raiding. So this also goes on to how do you start raiding, which is there are lots of people that just want to help. Partly for that reason, like we just want to get in, we want to have fun, we want to practice ourselves as well. So it's, I would say, the party finder anxiety and socializing in raiding sort of both can be solved with that one thing, which is find yourself in the right environment and surround yourself with the right people to go in with, and sort of try and build a circle, a social circle that you raid with and you make parties with. And then also, if you're thinking about forming a static and going hardcore, the people that you find in these situations, the people you bring together, can be a really good foundation for a static. Because statics are hard to make, I'll admit. I've done it a few times, and it doesn't always work out the first time, because you need 8 people. But if you can at least get the first few people that you can trust and that are like-minded, that's a good start. Yeah, I don't want to say just make friends for head. Like, it's not always so easy, and I understand that. So maybe you're just going to PF and you're just you're on your own. You're just going to PF solo. So maybe that's the situation that you're dealing with. You've got PF anxiety and you're on your own. I guess I can say it depends on where it's coming from. If you're worried about making mistakes and being judged for it, I don't remember the name of anyone that has made a mistake in my parties, so you can at least take some comfort in that. But that doesn't solve the entire problem. I know it's not that simple, but if you're feeling judged, just remember, people don't really remember individuals. But yeah, you did ask this earlier. You mentioned getting kicked. I'm trying to think of the best way around this. It may just be... maybe you just need to... Oh, I'm not sure, really. I think I've said what I can. It is a tough problem. I really don't like it when people get kicked. That's sort of a... That's a problem with other people, I would say, but it doesn't help the individual. Yeah. It happens, and it's out of your control. There's unfortunately not a solution for that specifically, because like the best we can do is collectively try and just improve the attitude towards raiding as a whole and how we treat each other. And I myself have been kicked as well, because I did make a string of mistakes. Like I said, everyone has bad days, and it feels awful. And it can make you feel like not wanting to go back in again. Especially if you're worried about encountering the same people. And sometimes also you'll get kicked for the complete wrong reason. So you might have been completely in the right and they misunderstood and they ended up kicking you, and that's also, that doesn't feel great. You have a macro telling shortly what you have in parties? Do you mean like upcoming mechanics? Because I guess that's another thing. If it can help alleviate anxiety around performance... Oh no? Well, I'll say this anyway. If it helps alleviate anxiety around performance, do whatever you can to sort of assist yourself. So for me, that's keeping a spreadsheet. So I'm a streamer, I have 2 monitors. I have a spreadsheet on my other screen when I'm learning that just lists everything that I need to do. And while I'm learning, I'll just be reading off that. You don't always have to keep everything in your brain. And so maybe you could have, like I've seen people putting sticky notes on their screen with diagrams and whatnot. You could write it on pen and paper, put it in front of you. Do whatever you can to make the fight easier on yourself. Short of course, using add-ons to do things for you. That's sort of... Because then you're not really doing the mechanic. Something's telling you what to do, which is... You don't want to do that. And also, if you write things down, it can help you internalize it, help you memorize it. So just the act of writing it down, that's actually with my spreadsheet that I have alongside my rating, just writing it down often helps me to understand what's going on better. I do need to move on with questions though. So, how do you combat raid fatigue? I'm assuming... Well, I'm going to assume that's asking about... maybe raiding for long hours. Or it could be raiding day in, day out and getting tired of it. And honestly, I think just it's the general approach to raiding and just trying to always find something valuable or positive about what you've done. This may not answer the question directly, because it really depends on what the context is, but I talked about it throughout the slideshow, which is try and find value in every single pull and take pride in the little things you do that you do well, the things you've improved on, or the things you did that might have saved a pull. I think it's just helpful to have a generally to work on having a positive mindset, basically, and not let things get to you and not get frustrated. Because that's how I raid day in, day out, is by focusing on the good things that I got out of my day, rather than focusing on the fact that I didn't clear for 5 hours, or even more. Like, some days are really rough, where things are just not going your way. You're not getting anything. You're not getting any clears. So as long as you're always focusing on self-improvement, you'll at least get something out of the day. And so you can go into the next day of raiding, feeling better about how you're doing things. That's actually, yeah, that's good, Glizzy Glober. And I think, as well, so you say if you're, for example, I always ask in certain trials for a dot on someone I can look after for, or look for. So yeah, that can help with finding your place for a mechanic. Maybe you need that thing over someone's head to guide you. And you say, if your friend joins, you explain shortly what's up and why they have a marker on. So maybe going back to the party finder anxiety, it could be helpful to be, when you go into a party, to just explain where you're at as well. Because I think people generally be pretty receptive to that. If you join in and you say, hey, I'm a little bit nervous about this. Maybe it's my first time in the party or whatever, or first time going for re-clear. And just say, if there's anything I can improve on, please let me know. And I think if you introduce yourself in that way, people will be a lot more gentle. At least I would hope so, but I think it would work out better. Because oftentimes, most people mean well, and they do want to help. Because, again, going back to the point, you're all in the same party together. They need people to raid with, you need people to raid with. No one's getting a clear without each other. So, and I think people are generally very helpful. So if you ask for some advice, they'll give it. And if you make a mistake in the party, if you said beforehand that maybe you're a little bit sketchy on a mechanic and you might mess it up, rather than, I don't think any reasonable person, having heard that someone was worried about a mechanic and they did make a mistake, would then be antagonistic about it. They'll go straight at them and say, why did you do that? Why did you mess up? If you said beforehand that you're maybe a little bit unsure of the mechanic, I think they'll come forward and help you out. At least someone. I'm pretty sure one of the 7 other players will come forward and try to help you. And especially, let's say there's a party leader that is of the kicking type. So they're very quick to kick someone. I dare say if there is another person in the party that jumps in and starts helping before anything else is said, I think that's going to hold them back. I doubt it, because all of a sudden it's 2 people working together to solve a problem against them wanting to kick someone from the party. And so all of a sudden, if that other person is helping you and they want to kick you, if they kick you, I don't think the person that's helping is going to be too happy about that. And so yeah, I think it can mitigate that potentially. So maybe it's just a matter of being honest with where you're at. Because I do really believe there are a lot of helpful people out there. And people are generally really nice in Party Finder. I actually very rarely encounter bad eggs. So I think if you go in and you're just honest about where you're at, even if you've cleared before but you're just nervous about messing up, just be honest about it, and I think people will be very forgiving. Alright, let me get through the questions, because I thought half an hour would be a lot of time, but we're on not good pace at the moment, so I'll try and be a little more rapid fire with my answers now. So, even after clearing P4S, I'm scared to start learning ultimates. Any advice? Yes. Ultimates are basically just Savage, but faster. So, you can, and also longer. So you can think of an ultimate. So if you can do P1S, P2S, P3S, P3S can be a little iffy, but let's just say you can do those 3 fights in a row without making a mistake. That's pretty much the equivalent of doing an ultimate. So if you've done P4S, I take it you've memorized all those fights. If you can memorize 4 fights in a tier, you can also memorize an ultimate. Because if you're at that point and you're looking at ultimate, you're not going into any given Savage fight trying to remember how the mechanics work. Because this is specifically speaking for someone that's got them on farm. So you're not going into P2S, for example, and a mechanic happens and you go, oh, I don't know how this works, I've completely forgotten. That's pretty much how it is in Ultimate. Like, once you've learned it, you'll remember it. It's like riding a bike. So, the second part to that is, where do you start getting into Ultimates? Which is, Ultimates are being pugged so much these days. Like, it's actually great. One of the best things that came out of the content drought at the end of Shadowbringers was people started pugging Ultimates, and people realized Ultimates were puggable. So you can actually get yourself into a practice party, and from what I've seen, they generally fill, and just do a Phase 1 prog party, and just learn Phase 1. And I think you'll actually find Phase 1 is pretty easy. Like, it is Savage difficulty, and then you'll do Phase 2, and that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. But every single mechanic just boils down to stand here, go there, for the most part. There are harder phases, but that's what makes an ultimate. But there are a lot of mechanics which are just learn where you need to stand and where you need to go. And it's pretty much if or else. So you might have a thing over your head, that means you go here, otherwise you go that way. And then if I'm speaking about the first mechanic in what is it, Thornton, the first phase of Thornton, that left to right priority system that you might use is the same as what you do in P4S. The fundamental is the same. When you're doing Act 2 in P4S, one DPS has to go left, one has to go right. How do you figure it out? You set up a priority system. And it's the same thing. It's a little more involved because it also involves the healers. But you can draw on that past knowledge. Ultimates are pretty much the same. You prog them the same way as a Savage. They're just a little bit faster, a little bit more complex, and they're just a marathon. But if you just treat each phase as its own thing. Treat it like Phase 1 is P1S, Phase 2 is P2S, so on and so forth. Just try and get used to each one at a time, and then you'll find well, there you go, you're ultimate progging, and you're making your way through. Someone asked, how long do or would I wait for someone that's disconnected? Usually just 5 minutes. It's not really... I mean, it also depends how much you feel you need them. If it's a healer or a tank and I sat in PF for ages looking for one, I'll probably wait a little bit longer. But if it's a DPS, and DPS a dime a dozen, maybe not Fizz ranged, I think Fizz ranged are a bit hard to find, then probably 5 minutes. So next question, how should you share criticism of someone's play? Example, someone keeps making same mistakes on the same mechanic and they say they understand their mistake, but they keep making the same mistake. We kind of talked about this, and this question might have actually been asked before we talked about it. So maybe I'll skip this one, because we did talk about this, actually. It was one of the first questions asked, so I think it was probably asked before we talked about it. Otherwise, if you want the answer, we did go over it, so you can check the VOD. Next question, how do you memorize patterns and think while under pressure? First off, if I'm having trouble, I stop pressing buttons. So I mentioned this earlier. The moment the situation becomes too stressful for me to be able to do everything at once, I drop the thing that doesn't matter, which is my rotation. And then I'll fully focus on what I need to do in the mechanic. And memorizing patterns, oftentimes there are a set of rules to a mechanic that can... so you don't necessarily have to remember how everything works, you just understand a simple set of rules. So, for example, in P1S on Intemperance, where you're wondering if you have to swap with the tank, or the tank has to swap with the DPS, when you're looking at the crystals. If you look at North, if they're alternating, it's no swap. Else, do swap. So you're only looking for one of two things. You don't need to remember them both. You just look for one of the two that tells you what to do. So rather than thinking, if they're alternating, don't swap. If it's one, then... so if it's blue, then orange, then orange. Or, dark, then light, light, depending on if you're colorblind or not. You don't need to actually know that second one, because it not being the first one already tells you what to do. And then I think it's the... Honestly, I can't even remember off the top of my head, because, again, I apply this to myself. I don't commit things to memory that I don't necessarily need to. I believe if they're all the same south, then it is not a swap, but I could be wrong, because I personally use the north crystals as a reference. But yeah, so you only need to remember one thing and just block out everything else. If there are only two options for the mechanic, just remember one, and if it's not that, you do the other thing. Yeah, loads of mechanics at 50-50, not a 1 in 3. Some are 1 in 3, so like in Ultimate Weapon, Ultimate, Suppression is potentially a 1 in 3, but it actually starts as a 50-50 and then another 50-50. So Suppression can be boiled down to, the first step is, do you have Eruption? If yes, go forwards, else go right. That's a very simple 50-50. All of a sudden, you've done most of the mechanic in an instant. And then, if you do have to go to the right, you have one more 50-50, which is, do I have something on my head? Yes or no? And that's the whole mechanic. That's the most number of steps anyone has to solve for what is, well, the last mechanic. Pretty much the last hard mechanic of Uwu. So I hope that answered the question. I'll quickly say one more, which is in P4S Act 2. This goes back to what I said as well about constantly finding something to improve. I'd been away from the game for a while. I was playing Elden Ring, and I came back, and I had forgotten how to quickly and easily identify which spot was the safe spot on Act 2. And so I just looked at it pull by pull, and I realized if I look north, if the second tether is on the left, then I'm going left. This is specifically as a tank, looking at it. So left being west. If it's on the right, then I go right, which is... So I'm looking at my two possible options. One is left, one is right. And the direction of the tether is literally just telling me which way to go. So I don't need to remember anything specifically. It becomes a visual thing where the tether is just guiding me in the direction I need to go. So that's another approach you could try and take. Oh boy, I've got 8 minutes left, so let's try and get through some more questions. Any tips for Pinax? Your group is struggling resolving cloak sword in the middle of it. Always use arm's length shorecast, regardless of whether it's cloak or sword. Just assume it's going to be cloak, and you will never get knocked back. Because it's free. It'll come up the next time you need it anyway. If it's sword, no harm, no foul. If it's cloak, you already did the mechanic. So I don't actually check, personally. I just press it anyway. Someone asked, how do you deal with your group morale when it starts to decline? So that sort of goes back to the keeping a positive attitude. You know, it's always winnable. But if things are really rough, just take a break. Just give people 5 minutes. And again, try and have an environment where making mistakes is okay. Worst case scenario, you might just need to call the day. And it's better off calling the day off early and just relaxing than hitting your head against a wall where people are just struggling. If you're really stuck on a mechanic that you're supposed to be past and morale is declining, I'd say just call the day. Just give everyone the time off. Because it's really not worth it. But only if it seems insurmountable on the day. And also, once people have slept on it, usually once you sleep on something, you come back and it's a little more internalized. At least that's how it works for me. So usually the next day will be better. The faster you get to the next day, the better. And we all know sleeping is a time skip, so you get to tomorrow really fast when you go to sleep. Yeah, it's exactly like Oblivion. Someone asks, I want to try healing in Savage, but scared you won't improve. Any tips? Yeah, so go in, give it a go, and step 1 is just make sure people are always full HP. So use your GCD. When I was learning healer, I heavily leaned on my GCD, and going back to the point of focus on one thing to improve every single pull, I would start to use my my OGCDs. So in the case of Scholar, I would use my fairy abilities, and I would just, on every single pull, I would observe how that affected whether I was doing enough, basically. And if I wasn't, then I would do a GCD. And next time around, I might dump an extra OGCD. And because healing is pretty much possible to do without any GCDs for the most part. It's always good to have an extra layer of safety, so just throw a GCD in here and there. There's nothing wrong with that. Doing the occasional GCD heal over an offensive GCD is a very small loss, as long as you're being otherwise efficient about things. So just work on it, pull by pull, is what I would say. You don't have to be, and you will never be a perfect healer when you first start out. Just work on it every single pull, try and find something new to improve on. Someone asked, in current content Savage progging, currently P1 to 4S, what is the appropriate way to deal with the feeling of time crunch to finish a tier before the next tier starts? Well, you don't necessarily need to. So I guess it depends on if it's a personal achievement thing or if you want to be ready for next tier, because for every new raid tier you can always just buy crafted gear that will get you straight into the next one. If it's personal achievement, unfortunately the only thing you really can do if you miss clearing by next tier is to find a group that goes back and does it again. Sometimes people go back and do it for glamour, but that's not exactly prog. Someone asked, how do you handle the mitigation discussion? So that's actually something my static has been working through recently. And Gerald, who's sitting in the front row in front of me right now, I've been working with him because he's my co-tank now on our reprisals. And basically, I just said to him, which I've also said to you guys, which is just start using your mitigation. Use it on everything, and then adjust as needed. So this is similar to every single job where you use things on cooldown, and if you have too much on one thing, just take something out and push it later. So like let's say you're a dancer using Shield Samba, but it's more than you need, and then you die to something else, then you say, okay, we've got too much here. Just pick something. It doesn't actually have to be anyone in particular. Just pick someone and say, okay, you now put Samba on the next mechanic. And it's as simple as that. So I would say start with using everything, and then when it goes wrong, fix it from there. If you find you come up to a raid wide that does too much damage and you don't have enough, take it off the thing before that and move it later. I have 2 minutes left, so I think... let me just find one more good question here. I apologize that I couldn't get to all of them because there were actually over 50 questions and I had an hour and a half, so there's actually no way I was realistically going to get through them all. But again, you can ask questions at me on my stream. And I'll talk your ear off for hours, literal hours. Okay, so last question. When recruiting new members to a static, what do you look out for in them, such as skills or if they vibe with the rest of the static, and what do you try to determine about their skills during a tryout session? Also, what are some red flags to watch out for? So, vibing with the static is really important. If someone doesn't mesh, that's pretty much a no. You kind of want them to fit into the team. I've had people in the past that didn't quite mesh, and it was a little uncomfortable, to say the least. As for skills, just want to make sure it's pretty much mechanics first mindset is the most important thing. And then obviously you can do a second test, see if they know how to do their rotation, but the first thing you want to find is... And you throw curveballs at them, right? So if you're recruiting, do weird strats, make up weird strats, throw them at them, and see how they approach doing something that they're uncomfortable with. Because that's pretty much the only way to determine that about someone outside of an actual prog environment. Because once everyone knows all the fights that are out right now, you can't really test that skill. Red flags, basically, greed before mechanics. That's all I have time for, unfortunately. Yeah, I can't go over half past. So as much as I would like to keep answering questions, my time slot is up. So thank you everyone for coming, and let me turn this around. We had so many people here. This is actually G-Pose, there's probably more. Let me look. Okay, yeah. thank you. I hope it was helpful. There's always more I can talk about, so if you catch me on my stream, I'll talk your ear off. I'm always happy to answer questions. So I appreciate you all being here. You've been great. Yeah. Enjoy the rest of LunaCon. I have a meet and greet tomorrow, around about the same time. I think half an hour earlier than this started. Or half an hour later, I'll have to double check. But again, thank you. Have a good rest of your day.